Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Robert Lappner. I'm the Dean of the NYU School of Continuing and Professional Studies. And tonight's program, on a rather somber topic, terrorism and its effects on life and the industries of New York, is part of the 75th anniversary events organized on the occasion of the founding of our school and as we begin our next 75 years on our future. Our school was established in 1934 in a spirit of public service outreach during the Great Depression. And we have always been responsive to the career development needs of professionals in our community and to providing opportunities for citizenship education. Though we have evolved over the intervening decades and are now home to exceptional graduate and undergraduate programs and a remarkable faculty of reflective practitioners and scholars, much of what we do is grounded in fields that are the economic and cultural engines that have secured New York's leadership on the world stage. And like those fields of practice, they are local and global, and subject to factors that arise from conditions, opportunities, and tensions in a constant dynamic. They're not subject to one field's area of practice, nor subject to any sovereign state's control. Even in the more lighthearted subjects that we teach, change is a constant. And for that, along with degree education, the need for continuing education remains evergreen. As the late John Wooden advised his collegiate basketball champions, it's what you learn after you know it all that counts. That's an embedded part of our mission, to create opportunity for learning at all stages of one's career and life's path, and to also provide for New Yorkers a forum for an informed public to keep apprised of issues that affect the vitality and the well-being of our society. Hence tonight's program. New Yorkers, unfortunately, don't have to be reminded of the reality of global terrorism. But it struck my colleagues at SCPS that immediate conversation about the issue from multiple perspectives would cast light in ways of understanding and acting and advance the reflections of industry leaders, civil libertarians, experts in security, government planners, and the informed commentators on whom we all rely. This event is in fact a collaborative undertaking within our school, led by the Center for Global Affairs, the Preston Robert Tisch Center for Hospitality, Tourism, and Sports Business, and the NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate. There are clearly diverse academic orientations and relations with scholarly and professional communities explain our stellar panel this evening and its very unique composition. Among the experts here this evening, we are grateful to be joined by academic colleagues from the NYU School of Law, as well as the John Jay School of Criminal Justice. Let me acknowledge, and I ask your help in doing so, the conceptual team behind tonight's event, my colleagues, divisional deans and faculty members, Mark Aliati, Bjorn Hansen, Jim Stuckey, and Vera Jelinek, and from my staff, Trish Arbib and Stephanie Levinsky. Thank you. I have no podium, so I'm holding and clapping at the same time. I ask your indulgence. And of course, a key member of our planning is the unrivaled moderator for tonight's program, the director of our school's public dialogues and university professor, Arthur Miller. From the animated conversations ahead of us, we are certain to learn a great deal from the interchange among an exceptional gathering of world-renowned leaders in thought and in action. As evidence of the importance of tonight's program, we're additionally honored by the presence this evening of the president of New York University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 15th president of NYU, John Sexton.
So I think we all can remember where we were on September the 11th, 2001. It's one of those days that's etched in the memory of certainly of all New Yorkers and probably of all humankind. For me, my memories of that day begin the night before. September the 10th was a special day. For those of us like Arthur and me who root for the Yankees, we were looking forward to a night game between the Yankees and the Red Sox. Roger Clemens was pitching or scheduled to pitch for the Yankees, and it was to be the day that the Red Sox were eliminated mathematically. from the pennant race. It portended glory and wonder. My son and I, along with two law school trustees, a man named Lenny Wilf and a man named Chris Krakenbush, were going to go to the game together. And I remember it vividly because Lenny, who seemed to know everything, I mean, he's a master of inside information, said he wasn't going to show up for the game even though it was scheduled to start at 7. He wasn't going to come until 8 because it was going to rain until 8 o'clock. And this was the old Yankee Stadium, so if it rained and you had seats that weren't under cover and ours weren't, you had to kind of squeeze like sardines out in the hallways. And Chris and my son Jed and I were squeezed in among the throng. That didn't prevent Chris, who was a wonderful human being, from bidding in a charity auction for a round of golf with President Clinton. And he won the bidding. Exactly 8 o'clock, Lenny showed up. The rain stopped. We walked out to the seat. We'd brought towels. We dried off the seats, and we waited for an hour and 15 minutes while they tried to dry the outfield, but it was like a lake. They called off the game, so Chris got home early. So Chris was therefore at his desk in the World Trade Tower the next day when the planes hit, and he died. I remember on the Wednesday after, calling the deans together. I had been named president the previous May, and I called them together and I said, you know, it doesn't behoove us now to do strategic planning. There's too many variables. We don't know whether there are going to be 5 or 6 more attacks between now and Thanksgiving. We had to make one decision. There was an admissions open house planned for that sad day. We had 2,000 people signed up to come. We had to decide whether we were going to go forward with it. We decided we'd reschedule, but we'd do it, and we'd give people the choice. And it was interesting because about 3,000 people came. Only about half of them, the people that were scheduled to come. But others who found out there was an event to which they could come, came. But on that Wednesday, I said to the deans, other than that decision, there's one strategic decision we're going to make. From now on, I don't want us to call ourselves New York University. I want us to refer to ourselves as the New York University. I want to affirm our connection with the city. And that then set off a number of moves. So within 2 weeks, we had broken ground on Furman Hall, the first building on which ground was broken in New York City. Justice O'Connor came up to help us break the ground. And within 2 weeks, we had signed the lease in the Woolworth building, the first lease to be signed in downtown New York, which is now the home of the School of Continuing and Professional Studies. And that's been a theme that's run through the last 9 years, affirming the connection to New York City. There's no better manifestation of that connection to New York City than the School of Continuing and Professional Studies. Over 75 years, it's been the place where New Yorkers could come. Now, of course, they can come and get degrees, some of the degree programs being the best in field. But they also can come for the delight of a particular course, or for the intellectual delight of a particular evening with panelists such as the ones that come together for us today. And I thank each of you for that. I have, having blessed the event, the modest task of introducing, I should say, a man who literally needs no introduction, but a man who's been a part of my life since the day in 1975 when he walked into my first law school class and with a gesture of his hand almost pointed at a woman across the room who, once I noticed her, I realized was the most magnificent being ever to walk the earth. It was in Arthur's class that I met my wife. We were married within 2 months under his tutelage. She and I were part of a group of about 5 or 6 of us that had to move him through the neuroses that comes from growing up in Brighton Beach as a Yankee fan. And to indulge him in providing the first audience for his first TV appearance on Channel 5 in Boston, Sunday morning at 9 in the morning, where Lisa and I and her brother and the 2 others in our merry band of 5 were the only people in the room under 70. And Arthur was trying to whip up the crowd around privacy and freedom. And that began this career, which grew to this. And I might not be here were it not for this. Because after Lisa and I married, we wrote Arthur a note when we said we thought you might be interested that 2 of your students got married. And he took us to dinner at the Ritz Hotel to celebrate, just the 3 of us. And that night he said, you know, there's this man named Fred Friendly, and he's asked me to do something, but it requires me to go away for 2 weeks in March. And you have to remember, I was the oldest person in our class. I was 33 years old. I'd been a college professor. And he said, you know, the day I called on you in class, you performed well, and I hear you want to be a teacher in a law school someday. What would you think about taking over my first year civil procedure class for 2 weeks as the professor come next March? Now, this was the Harvard Law School. This was 150 of my peers in civil procedure, the toughest. I said, do you mean this? He said, yes. And so it was that I did that in our second year, and after I survived, but in that class were Jane Ginsburg, now a university professor at Columbia, and Harold Koh, later the dean of Yale Law School. But they were so, it was like that song in Promises, Promises. What do you get when you fail in love? When you wonder if the high note is going to get hit, you know, and they for 2 weeks they worried I'd fall on my face, and they rooted for me, and as of course every teacher loves that. And then Arthur brought me back again in my 3rd year to do the same 2 weeks, and brought in the Harvard Personnel Committee to see it, and thus began the but-for causality that landed me in the school where I wanted to be, because I knew it was the only place that this Brooklyn accent could be understood. So I'm delighted to introduce to you a man that needs no introduction, but you know that part. What I want you to know is that this man not only is the great star of what became a decade of Fred Friendly shows like tonight, but this man is the finest mentor, the finest co-author, the finest friend, the finest brother by another mother that anyone can ever have. My Gumbare, Arthur Miller.
What are we going to do? I met with the panelists about a half an hour ago, and I said, we're going to have a bold session. So understand that what happens here is unrehearsed, it's spontaneous. No one's going to make speeches at you. I have told them, let's have a bold session. And it's a bold session about terrorism and New York. And hopefully they will stay awake long enough so that we make it until 8:15 when you can ask questions. And it's really at that point that we will know where we have been. I've asked them to introduce themselves. They're now on an ego trip, not realizing that the only reason that they're introducing themselves is so that we can make sure the microphones are working. Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith Stubblefield. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at BAM, where we welcome over 500,000 cultural visitors a year here in New York City.
Hi, I'm Karen Greenberg. I run the Center on Law and Security at the NYU School of Law, where we study terrorism and counterterrorism.
Ray Bixon, Taj Hotels. We're Southeast Asia's largest hotel company. We're represented here at the Pierre in New York.
I'm Jim Hoge. I was formerly editor of Foreign Affairs magazine for 18 years, but as of the beginning of this month, I've become chairman of Human Rights Watch Advocacy Group.
I'm Jim Stuckey. I am Divisional Dean of NYU's Schack Institute of Real Estate, and I'm also president of New York City's Public Design Commission.
I'm Kevin Hallinan. I am the former Senior Vice President for Security and Facility Management for Major League Baseball, where I spent over 20 years there. Prior to that, I was the first commander of the joint FBI New York City Police Terrorist Task Force.
I'm Bill Bratton. I'm currently the chairman of Trowell, the risk mitigation firm, previously police commissioner in 1994 here in New York, and most recently police chief of the Los Angeles Police Department.
And you can tell the Boston accent.
I'm Laura Murphy. I direct the Federal Relations Office for the American Civil Liberties Union, the nation's oldest and largest civil liberties organization, and we're celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. Thank you. Thank you. Contribute too. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mark Galliotti. I'm the academic chair of the Center for Global Affairs here at SCPS, and my research essentially focuses on bad people, particularly organized crime and terrorists.
I'm Jacques Schuch. I'm coming from Israel. I'm the CEO of BSI company, which is a security company of 30 years of experience in counterterrorism activity.
I'm Jim Trowell. I write about foreign policy for the New York Times Magazine, and I write a weekly column for the website foreignpolicy.com.
The only thing Jim has written that I've taken a cotton to is he did a cover profile of Mariano Rivera a few months ago.
Who is not, I should repeat, a terrorist threat, so far as I know.
Hi, I'm Chuck Strozier. I'm not in a suit. I'm a historian at John Jay College, and I also direct the Center on Terrorism there, which attempts to study terrorism in a way that's appropriate for university, but tries to make that knowledge serve useful public purposes. I'm also a psychoanalyst, and I did a study starting the first weekend, actually, of survivors and witnesses of 9/11.
All right, a very varied group, but a group with an enormous amount of experience in the subject from various disciplines and occupations. I'm just John Q. Citizen. I need some basics. I need to understand some things I really don't understand. What's terrorism? What's terrorism? Now, Karen, your group over there at the law school studies terrorism. What is it? How will I know it?
Okay, it's such an unfair question, but let me just say one thing about it. The interesting thing about your question is that the United States has assumed the definition of terrorism in current times as Islamic fundamentalist violent extremism. And for our purposes, that's what terrorism has been defined as for 10 years. But I want to say, in Europe, they have not defined terrorism. They have different definitions of terrorism, and it's one of the reasons their policies cannot be unified. So there's your...
Well, that leaves me even more confused than before I asked the question.
Yeah.
What is terrorism? What is terrorism?
It's a mix of intentions and capabilities.
Intentions and capabilities.
Yeah.
So when someone is very disenchanted with the Internal Revenue Service of the United States and gets a small plane and flies it into the IRS building in Texas, is that terrorism?
Exactly. It's exactly terrorism. Because terrorism is not a question of numbers. It's not a numbers game. Terrorist is a game of individuals.
Was Son of Sam a terrorist?
No.
Why?
Terrorism
You're so convinced. No.
Yes, no.
Yes,
Terrorism has to be political violence. is performative political violence, but if it's not political, it fits into a different category. So it's criminal activity, but not all criminal activity is terrorism.
Oh, so if I go from Son of Sam to the Unabomber, what do you say?
That's going from serial killer to terrorism.
So the Unabomber's a terrorist, but Son
Absolutely.
of Sam isn't.
Well, you could say terrorism is it's a horrible form of speech. It's an enactment of speech. It's a performance.
Do I
in
have
some
to
way.
speak to be a terrorist?
No, of course not. Terrorism isn't itself a form of speech. It's as if you have taken you've used violence as a form of public expression about something. So somebody who is a mass murderer, for example, like Son of Sam, is not a terrorist. I think part of our problem, though, is that we have thought of terrorism so much as a specific form of expression, this religious expression, Islamic terrorism. And of course, before World War I, for example, there was an enormous spate of terrorism, anarchists with bombs. That was terrorism too. And so terrorism is a method which comes out of a certain desire to use violence in an expressive form. Now we think of it in Islamic terms, but in fact that's simply a current manifestation of it.
So I sense an agreement with Karen that this notion of fixating on Islamic terrorism is just too narrow.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Can I just add one thing?
It's the
It's
flavor of the
also, would you say that it's, the targets have to be, would you say they could be government people or they are largely civilians? I mean, there is something about terrorism being aimed at civilians as opposed to some kind of military outpost, and that could include government agents like the FBI. Is that how you would?
But what about Timothy McVeigh? He was engaged in a terrorist act against the Murrah Federal Office Building.
Exactly.
And so it doesn't have to be a civilian attack. Terrorism is a series of criminal acts designed to achieve a political outcome, to put someone's viewpoints on the map through violence.
But there were a number of civilians killed, and they knew, just like they have in a number of the sting operations of the FBI recently, that civilians are maybe the byproduct of it, but they knew how many civilians were in that building, just as in the buildings that were targeted in Illinois and in Dallas earlier last year.
Does someone have to die?
Yeah, I would just mention that during the 1980s, when we had a rash of domestic terrorist violence, where the targets were the military, law enforcement, et cetera, and civilians were not targets at that time. And it was groups such as the FALN and Black Liberation Army and groups such as that. Now, however, it's changed dramatically. Now we are all targets as Americans, both here and overseas.
Terrorists basically want to change the world. This is their way of doing it. They choose not to use the ballot box. They choose not to write op-eds. Instead, they use violence. And in that respect, in a way, it doesn't matter who the target is. It doesn't even matter if anyone dies. Often, actually, just simply creating fear is just as good from their point of view.
So burning across.
Exactly, I was going to say.
Burning across, does it?
Yes, it can. It doesn't have, no one necessarily has to die, but so many people knew the Ku Klux Klan. Some of them were sheriffs, some of them were in government, and at night they put on robes, and all they had to do was burn across to send a signal that people should not advocate for their civil rights, and it terrorized people.
Right, but it was also often combined with a lot of lynchings, which was definitely extended the terror. I think there's an important difference in the forms of terrorism where it used to be sort of left-wing, and the violence was relatively contained, like the PLO, the IRA. I mean, the more familiar kind of old forms of terrorism. And I think I think the transitional decade was the 1990s into the more familiar forms now, which is right-wing, religiously based. And once it gets tied to religious aspirations, and this is not just Al-Qaeda, once it gets tied to religious aspirations, that takes the limit off the violence that they aspire to.
Why, by the way, do you say right-wing? Why do we think of Al-Qaeda as being right-wing as opposed to the Baader-Meinhof gang as being revolutionary? Its intention is all revolutionary, I suppose.
It's all revolutionary, but it comes out of a different context with different kinds of aspirations, and seeks to kill for its own sake and kill large numbers with a transformative goal that is quite different from say the IRA, which wants something within the political process. And it's a left-wing political movement that wants to create, free Ireland.
If I listen to Laura, I get the feeling that anyone who frightens me is a terrorist, like the Texas Rangers.
No, you have to have the capacity to do harm and to execute harm. And the Klan was frightening because of its cross-burning, because of its relationship to lynchings and terrorizing people physically and doing them harm. So I don't think it's just an ideological act, although it can be construed that way.
It has to be illegal, it has to be premeditated, it has to have a political intent.
Burning the Koran in Lower Manhattan? What is that?
Is it illegal? Is it premeditated? Does it have sort of political intent? If you can tick those three boxes.
Wearing a white robe with a pointy cap and burning a cross isn't illegal, but it frightens Laura.
Well, it doesn't frighten me, but it represents a tide of activities that took place during an era where people were lynched, beaten, humiliated at the hands of the government, and state and local law enforcement did nothing about it. And that's why it was terrorizing.
All right, now you're describing something that's very contextual.
Absolutely.
So, Bill, from a police point of view, how do you decide what's just a serial killer type and what's terror?
Well, it's obvious from the comments that have already been made that there is no consensus as to what constitutes terrorism, no agreed upon, one size fits all, if you will. There was a document that was just released last week by Homeland Security, which looked at 86 acts of terrorism as by their definition. And I think their definition provides a framework. In that framework, I can guarantee everybody at this table will probably have actions outside of that framework in terms of what their sense of terrorism is. And that's one of the issues with it, that in terms of what is terrorism, what creates fear, the current focus on jihadism in terms of, but jihadism in the United States over the last 10 years has constituted less than 40% of the attempted terrorist attacks based on the definition of the United States government. So that in some respects, the efforts by the various militias and neo-Nazi white supremacist groups have actually constituted a larger threat.
But
to
Bill,
the
have they
United
got a
States and
definition there?
jihadists. I'm sorry?
Have they got a definition there you can share?
Actually, I think, as I listen to you, it actually might set a framework. This was very specific to this case study, which looked at 86 acts of terrorism where the intent was to basically take a life. And it looked at the various actions over the last 10 years. So the definition was that, and it's the one that the Global Terrorism Database uses. Specifically, it has to meet two of the three following requirements. The act was aimed at attaining a political, economic, religious, or social goal. 2, the act included evidence of an intention to coerce, intimidate, or convey some other message to a larger audience or audiences other than the immediate victims. Or 3, the act was outside the precepts of international humanitarian law.
Sounds like my teaching.
Exactly.
So how about Sherman's March to the Sea?
That's war. That's war.
That's war.
That's war.
War is not terrorism.
The targets are non-combatants. The targets are civilians, a very important part of terrorism. I mean, there is a question, a very important question of definition, whether there's such a thing as state terrorism. So how do we deal with Hiroshima, for example?
Wait, what's Hamas? Hamas doesn't commit terrorism because they constitute themselves as a military body? I assume when Hamas attacks civilians, it fits very much the definition that Bill just read. It's a means of saying something beyond the victimization of those people.
So was Sherman's March. It wasn't just against soldiers, it was
Right.
against civilians throughout the South, and it had a larger purpose, which was to scare the hell out of the South and demoralize
It
it.
fits Laura's notion of fear. And if you were a Southerner, the notion of the Grand Army of the Republic descending on Savannah scared the crap out of you.
Yes?
Well, okay.
There also were very few people killed. In Sherman's March, mostly it was chickens. I mean, it was an unopposed army that spread out over 50, 60 miles and marched from Atlanta to the sea, completely unopposed, so that there were no battles. It was an attempt to show the power of the North in the South, which
Precisely,
then got.
but victims are more than people he killed. Victims were all the people who were scared to death by what he did, burning down houses.
And everyone in the
whatnot.
plantations in the South joined, started following the army too, because they were liberated.
Just for the sake of clarity, let me just say that the reason we're having this little talk 9 years after 9/11 is because 9/11 happened. And while individual or even organized acts of violence, like for political reasons, within the United States have always been there. We've always had extremist terrorism in a variety of forms, and we continue to have it. The fact is that transnational terrorism, in which no part of the globe is necessarily off grounds for any legal reason, in which you don't have to declare war, seems to me a very different thing. And so I just want to make sure that if you're going to talk about addressing this, if you put too much into the category, I don't really understand how we can begin to think about addressing causes or the remedies in terms of security. So I would just like to offer that maybe we could talk about domestic extremism in one category and international terrorism, sponsored by states or not, in another category.
I'll give an example. I was here during 9/11. I ran a hotel for 15 years. 22 months ago, I spent 14 hours in the Taj Bombay, while in 10 locations in the city, 10 terrorists took us 3 days, as you know. But essentially, there were two statements here. One was the iconic status of the visual of the Taj, what that represents for India Inc. and the story of the emerging world. And to a second extent, the soft targets of business, as in hotels or public areas like a train station or a railway, were just the innocent, I guess, effects of that type of statement that they made. But ideally, the statement that they wanted to make was to blow up the tower of the Taj in Bombay, which was on CNN for 3 days, and you just, that's all you saw. And so it's a combination of both, and that's really putting the context of what we've discussed in hard reality.
And I'd like to follow up on Karen's point, and your original question, Arthur, which is, what does John Q. Public think it is? And from my perspective, it's an unpredictable act of chaos that's designed to basically create instability in some form of orderly government. And it's a chaotic, unstable act that is unpredictable.
It's something we don't like.
And to create fear.
That's the feeling I'm coming away with. If I don't like it, it must be terrorism.
The chaos and the unpredictability of it is what creates the fear.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
but that's the goal.
There is not automatically a political goals after terrorist, behind terrorist actions. Because I believe that nobody here can tell us what is the political goals of Al-Qaeda those days. It's very, very unclear.
But we may not know it, but I don't think it's that they don't know it. I mean, it might be that we regard their political goals as being ridiculous, about creating an Islamic caliphate and destabilizing the West. And all
It is ridiculous.
But the point is, it doesn't mean that it's not there. In their own minds, they have a blueprint.
But an organization, okay, worldwide organization, needs to have very clear goals if they want to survive. And today, the weaknesses of Al-Qaeda is because of this situation. They are today in a situation which they have no real and clear goals, not only because of this reason. There are other reasons as well in the field, okay? But they don't have very clear political goals.
Of course, that could be a strength. And one of the things we've seen about Al-Qaeda is that they have, associate organizations, whether it's the Shabab or wherever it is in whatever country, and it's that cloudiness that allows more followers rather than fewer followers, which a very rigid definition that was tied to Saudi Arabia or whatever might have. So it actually could work the other way.
Yeah, but look at the influence of Al-Qaeda, okay, in countries that you can say 5 or 9 years ago, the influence was much, much higher, like in Algeria, Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. And you can see that today the influence is completely, you feel the weaknesses because people lost the goals of this organization.
I can't even imagine that you're saying that. We've built 33 buildings since 9/11 devoted to anti-terrorism policies. We passed the Patriot Act. We've created a whole new body of law. We've expanded the use of military tribunals. We keep 170 people in detention in Guantanamo. We've taken a jackhammer to our values. So as far as I'm seeing, Al-Qaeda is having success in turning the values of the United States on its head, bankrupting us because of what we're doing in thousands of offices within federal and local governments to abridge our own civil liberties. So,
But this goes exactly, oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I want to put some context on what
Yes.
Laura, I want to take us from Saudi Arabia or Nigeria to New York City.
Yeah.
Some local precinct here in New York gets one of those anonymous calls that says, a bomb's going off in Midtown Manhattan. And we'll put you back as police chief of New York, the best job you ever had. Now, how does that work, Bill? That call comes into a precinct. What do they do at the precinct?
Well, today they'd handle it very differently than they might have pre 9/11.
It's post 9/11. Part of this is what have we learned? So what happens at the precinct level?
At the precinct level, they'd basically begin the notification processes to get the appropriate resources, not only to the scene to determine if there is in fact an actual bomb, but there's a whole series of behind-the-scenes intelligence apparatus that now kicks into place.
Do you take every one of those calls seriously?
They do.
Every one of them?
They do.
Given this city, which
Given
is
this
filled
city,
with
and
nuts
that's
and
the
malcontents.
in this city, in Los Angeles, probably Washington. I can't speak for the rest of America, but the reality is that the farther you get away from New York, the issue of terrorism, as we think of the Al-Qaeda type action, there's less and less interest in it the farther you get away from New York. But in New York, the NYPD, the federal agencies, have really created a mechanism to treat all of these things seriously.
So it comes into the precinct, and where does it go out of the precinct? Will you, again, assuming you're police, you're Ray Kelly, you're today Ray Kelly. Does that come all the way up to Ray?
A bomb threat?
Yeah.
Today it probably would.
Today, every bomb threat comes up through
It probably would get up to him at some point in time that forces are responding, and after they do a quick analysis as to the potential veracity of it.
And
there's not that many of them, so it's not that he's going to be overwhelmed by bomb threats. That
and when you say testing the veracity of it, do you have a veracity meter?
In terms of within the intelligence services, there would be a significant multi-layered ability to start analyzing that threat coming in. Again, the world is a very different place than it was back in the 1990s, that the various centers that have been put together, fusion centers, real-time crime centers, CompStat centers, joint terrorism task forces, the high side, the low side, down in the National Counterterrorism Center.
So a lot of resources
There's a lot of sophistication, a tremendous amount of resources.
I mean, I'm just going back to Laura's point that we are now so attuned to terrorism, that our commitment
again, that
is
bomb
enormous.
threat, the issue of a bomb threat is usually intended to create fear, cause bodily harm, and oftentimes that threat is, under a more general classification, terrorism, is intended to advance a political belief or cause or effort.
Now, you get intelligence that suggests that the locale of the bomb threat is Penn Station, Madison Square Garden, that area. We'll make Kevin head of security at Madison Square Garden. Does he get notified?
He certainly does. Well, Kevin actually would have a lot of experience in terms of having worked in the joint terrorism task forces in New York for many years. So let me bounce the ball to him in the sense of his,
What do you
his
do?
actual experiences.
Wait, Bill. What do you do? Pick up the phone and say, "Hi, Kev, there's a bomb." Take care.
Actually, that would be one of the first calls to the, because what you'd expect of Madison Square Garden, Penn Station, is that they have procedures in place if they receive a threat to start basically looking to determine, is there something out of the ordinary here that would constitute verification of that threat?
And what do you do when you get Bill's call?
Well, I think it's what we've done before the call. After 9/11, Major League Baseball particularly, and I know the NBA and the NFL and the other leagues as well, we have trained our people in receiving these calls to try and maximize the information that we would get from a caller. What's particularly important is what was the language that was used? What did they say? Was that consistent maybe with where we had a bomb actually explode in another part of the city? So that you try and build a pattern just on speech alone. But everybody is trained, and there is a procedure with the police, with the FBI. Indeed, for the World Series and for All-Star games, all the phone lines coming in to that facility are being tracked, monitored, so that we can know where that call is coming from. And we've had that where the FBI and the police have responded to a phone booth in Staten Island and actually came up with a caller.
You like that, Laura?
No.
No. Why am I not surprised? Why don't you like that?
Well,
I mean, you know how many people can be at Yankee Stadium, Madison Square Garden? I mean, to be sure, if it's a Knick game, the place is empty.
I mean, these fusion centers that have been built since 9/11 have required a massive amount of resources. I like the fact that we're prepared to respond. I do like that, and I don't want to make light of that. But I also think we've invested an enormous amount of resources in state and local law enforcement for bells and whistles, in some cases that are used for other purposes, that are used to investigate peace-loving organizations who merely want to protest. So groups that are concerned about nuclear disarmament have been investigated by these fusion centers, groups that are concerned about animal welfare. So I think that we have started funding a series of activities, and we've lowered our focus on normal street crime, on white-collar crime, and we've focused so many of our national and local resources toward this terrorism threat, in my view, out of proportion to the threat.
I'd like to take exception with that for a second. I can't take exception with the investigation of animal rights groups, but I can take exception to the building of physical infrastructure that allows law enforcement to act. And I can say, as a person who has been involved in both municipal development and private development, that most of the public infrastructure in New York City, New York State, and the federal infrastructure was woefully inadequate to begin to address the types of potential attacks that could occur in this country today. Now, there is some catching up. So the 33 buildings that Laura mentioned before may be because 30 of them should have been built over the last 30 years and weren't. So there's obviously some catching up based upon the vulnerabilities that we've now detected as a nation. But I think to take that grossly to the other end and say we shouldn't make an investment in those type of facilities would be a strategic mistake as well.
Right, to refer to them as bells and whistles. From a cultural point of view, we, unlike Major League Baseball or the major sporting endeavors out there, we don't really have the resources probably to, and to the depth that they do to prevent a sort of terrorist act. We really depend on the local police precincts. BAM
So
does.
you're not protecting me when I go to BAM?
Of course we are. We're protecting you to the best that we can. You know, we rely on our local police precinct, as I was saying. We have a very good relationship with them. We do get bomb threats at BAM. I'd like to say that we don't, but we do. I'm sure my sister and brother cultural institutions get them as well. In February,
and what do you do when you get them?
Well, I'll tell you. I just wanted to put a practical face onto what Mr. Bratton was saying earlier. We called the police in. There was a bomb threat recently in February. In between two concerts, we had two shows about an hour apart. The bomb threat was called in during the hour off. The police came in and were able to actually sweep the building with the use of dogs, and the show went on maybe 15 minutes late. Nobody in the audience really knew any different. In my opinion, you know,
The audience didn't notice the dogs?
We actually
think that they were singing. And
no, the dogs were in the house. The audience was in the lobby. They weren't allowed in the house at that time. So we were able to keep it pretty much under wraps. We want our people to have a really people come to culture not to be terrified unless it's a a scary movie or something. But we were trying to give people a break from that, and the police department helps us very much.
Now, you mentioned resources, Keith, and the shortage of resources. We understand that.
Yes.
But are you making a decision that you do not want your audiences impacted with thoughts of anti-terror protection?
We do make that decision. You know, there's a conscious decision that we make not to search people's backpacks, for example. We're actually, we're concerned about recording devices, but, we would never, or at least not in this current environment, and not after 9/11, actually, we would never search someone's person for the purpose of detecting an explosive device.
Yet, they do look in my bag when I go to Yankee Stadium.
Well, I suspect that's more about maximizing their concession revenue than anything else.
Is that it, Kevin?
That's correct.
I mean,
What's your bag?
So I'm not the only cynic.
I know that when you were involved with Major League Baseball, you did a lot of research as to what was happening. Now, you can't tell me with a straight face that that long-haired clown that looks at my ticket when I go in and says, open my coat and then open my bag, is ever going to find anything. Am I better off? Do you really think I'm better off with you than I am with Keith, who basically says, the hell with you, I'm doing nothing for you?
Well, I can assure you that we took very, very serious what happened at 9/11 and the importance of us protecting our fans and our facilities. And what we did, which was really a change from what had happened in the past, we went down to the front lines and we trained. I actually produced a video with a lot of money from the other leagues and baseball called 24/7, which took a terrorist plot and showed the most important part of our security force at the front doors and the difference that they could make to make them realize that they were part of a team of people that had a very important role in what we were doing.
How do you make the decision whether to evacuate or not?
Well, it's a decision that's made jointly with the police who are with us there. They are really the decision maker as far as evacuation goes.
So, Bill, how do you make? I mean, evacuation is a rather dramatic act.
That's right, and you don't see too many of them, do you?
No.
So that's part of the sophistication and skill with the reality that at some point in time, the wrong decision is going to be made and an event's going to happen. That's the reality of it, and that's the reality of our lives today. But the good news is that all of the things that are done, whether it's the searches at an airport to get an airplane or to have your bag searched going into Yankee Stadium, which actually serves multiple purposes. They want to make sure you're not bringing booze in from the outside also, in addition to not coming in with a bomb. So it's a multifaceted search that they're conducting.
Well, as Keith said, if you're going to drink, they want to sell you the beer.
That's right, exactly. But it's the idea that it's interesting using the example you just used. A major focus of Homeland Security now is the idea, recognizing that the 50,000 federal agents, the 700,000 police, the 2.5 million security officers in the United States cannot protect everything all the time. That the reality is that there's a conscious effort underway, the campaigns you're hearing, the New York campaign, the I watch, you watch, we watch issues. The idea of trying to educate the public to, if they see something suspicious or they think is suspicious, if we can educate them as to what might be suspicious as it relates to terrorism or crime, to report it and then let people who are skilled at checking it out take a look at it. And it's why the fusion centers are now called all crime centers, because they don't just take terrorist reports, of which there are very few, but they take all the police reports, of which there are many, robberies, rapes, murders. And the reason for that study I referenced, the 86 cases that they looked at, only 16% of the cases, the terrorist cases that have occurred in the United States that fit the definition where there was an intent to take a life, that only 16% of them were detected by the intelligence apparatus of the government, the billions upon billions of dollars of sophisticated apparatus. The bulk of them were detected by a citizen calling in a suspicious activity, a police officer engaged in the investigation of a criminal offense, an FBI agent investigating a criminal matter that ended up having a nexus to terrorism. So it's the reinforcement of the idea that in dealing with terrorism, it's not necessarily just the intense concentration of, on terrorism itself, but understanding that there is a nexus oftentimes to traditional criminal behavior.
So that's the great story of Times Square, that it was
Exactly.
a vendor.
Times Square is in many respects just that story, that nobody had picked up on this character that was planning that bomb, much the same as they had not picked up on the Christmas Day underwear bomb. All the signals were missed by the intelligence apparatus. But it's the average person that sees something that's out of the ordinary that calls it in.
Ray, Bill has just referred to the fact that there was a lot of evidence about that Christmas bomber that was in the atmosphere. The Times reported a week or so ago that people here in the United States had advanced knowledge of what might happen at the Taj in Mumbai. How do you feel about that? You were never informed about that, were you?
Well, you know, being in an emerging economy like India, one looks at, let's look at travel and tourism. That's what I represent. Terrorism is just plain bad for business. And one has to understand that essentially travel and tourism, if 10 years ago you went through the spiel that we all go through at the airports today, where you practically are stripped down by the time you stand in line, the same thing sort of affects travel and tourism as a whole. You know, the seamlessness of security to that extent, there has to be a balance between both security and the actual aspect of living your life. You won't go to a luxurious hotel and spend $800 to $1,000 a day if somebody's going to strip search you as you come through the door. But at the same token, I think
some people might pay more.
But you know, one has to. One has to look at it. Imagine travel and tourism today is the largest employer in the world. 10 to 12% of global GDP comes from travel and tourism. Hotels, airlines, rent-a-cars. Every dollar, and you'll know, Linda, being the former head of tourism of Washington, D.C., every dollar that's generated in a hotel spends $8 in the economy. So, you know, there's balance between, at the end of the day, remember we have that business aspect of it that we have to protect, and that seamlessness of balancing going to a ball game, watching the Knicks, and that seamlessness of being in a public area or in such a high you know, touchy-feely emotional kind of thing as, you know, eating at Le Cirque or going to the Pierre, for that matter, of that protection or that seamlessness.
All right, let me put you into the story. Let me move the Pierre. In the hypothetical world, I can do whatever I want. I'm going to move the Pierre across the street from Madison Square Garden. You get a call from Ritter, who has joined us now. This is Bill Ritter, ABC, old friend of mine.
Thanks, Aunt Sarah. Appreciate that.
Let's assume Bill calls you up. And he asks you, what are you doing about that bomb threat? You don't have a clue. You haven't heard about any bomb threat at the Pierre or across the street at the Garden. Talk to him.
Well, I can first send him a couple emails and tweets we get from people at the Garden who see dogs and police presence galore, and ask what you're doing about it, and whether you feel, because there's a threat at the Garden, whether you have to evacuate this, you know, very popular hotel in the middle of Christmas season.
Well, you know, you would be surprised today if you understood, if you looked at a hotel and the infrastructure that's being put in place, it really is not akin to being in in a consulate or in an embassy abroad today. They're a large, they range from a control room, which has access, which can lock off and close off certain areas of the building for those type of events. Bollards, security. We have, today, based in Asia, in the Asian hotels, we have the equivalent of sky marshals that are ex-military guys, plainclothes, 6 or 8 people throughout your buildings. I'm sure Waldorf and,
Is that what you tell Bill when he says,
So you're going to leave the people there? If there's a bomb at Madison Square Garden, you're going to leave the people in your hotel across the street? Just because you lock the doors?
No. We're talking about in my building where we're responsible for a, 2,000 to 5,000.
Okay, so you have all these guests, and I'm calling you and saying there's a bomb at Madison Square Garden. There are police there galore. There are dogs.
Right.
There's a huge police presence. What are you going to do about your guests?
We have our own processes, I would say, that I guess that we would elevate that level of if it warrants evacuation, we would make that call as well, sure.
You evacuate right
I don't
in front of Madison Square Garden there, or do you go in the back door? Is there a back door there?
No, I think what we do is we would make our own search, and that would be based on what the security services would advise us and what our security services would do ourselves.
what do you do with that?
I would just tell you that the bomb, we understand, is not there. It's at Madison Square Garden. So what do you do then? Do you bring people out in the street? Because I'm trying to get a comment whether we can say the Pierre is evacuated, obviously.
Yeah, well, if it was across the street from, I don't think we would do that. Unless there was a serious threat to the occupants of our building, in our hotel, of those 20 to 40 stories in our building, you would establish that if there was a credible threat that we felt that required that to happen.
We're hearing that the police may be, I would assume, evacuating several buildings adjacent to the garden, not just the garden, right?
I guess we would be advised by the police and fire services.
Let me twist it a little bit. Forget about what's going on at the garden. It's quiet. It's just a quiet evening across the street from the Pierre, which is sitting there, pick your street, next to the garden. Nothing's happening at the garden. But he has gotten an anonymous call or an email that says, going to blow up the Pierre tonight. And he calls you up. You don't know a damn thing. What do you say to him?
Oh, that's a different story because
That's what I do. I make different stories.
No, no, Arthur. Actually, that's really the procedures that we would have in place would be as Kevin had to deal with if you were running Madison Square Garden or any of the facilities that you're responsible for. Those processes that you have in place would kick in, and basically there are different levels of escalation, which at the extreme would warrant evacuation.
I would tell you what I would say, Arthur. I'd say no comment. Yeah, I mean, because until you can verify that there's a legitimate threat, and most hotels and most major office facilities today do have procedures in place, I don't know that I would want to necessarily go on TV and create panic. So I think that there's something to say that you have a due diligence
Bill is
responsibility.
smiling there. What do you do with the
We don't want to go on TV and create panic either.
But you've asked the question.
But by saying no comment, you would then all of a sudden set off a million bells and whistles and red flags to us.
That's right, but I'd rather say that than to give you false information.
No, but you could just say, be honest and say, I hadn't heard that. Thank you for telling me. I'm going to call the police, or I'm going to use my own
possible, except, again, if ABC News calls, I'm not sure that I would necessarily want to say that at first. I'd like to find out the facts.
Wait a second, Jim. Are you advocating lying?
No, I'm advocating finding out the facts.
No. That's
I don't necessarily believe.
I mean, Ray knows he knows nothing.
I don't know that because ABC asked me a question, I'm obligated to answer that question. I have a fiduciary responsibility to in this particular case, the hotel, not to ABC News.
But Jim, how about a practical problem, which is, if they're calling you, they're probably going on the air with something. If they have to go on the air with a no comment for you, how's the public.
I'm not so
interpret
sure
that.
they would go on the air with a no comment, quite honestly. I think that they'd have to have a lot more due diligence done before they would just put a story.
Well, you're
of that
right on
nature.
there, yes. We would not go on with a no comment. We in fact, until 9/11, we never covered bomb threats, ever, ever, ever. We didn't cover suicides, it's the same kind of thing. We don't want to encourage people to do it, unless there is some great threat to the public safety. After 9/11, some of the rules changed. If there's a bomb about to go off at the Pierre Hotel, hypothetically, that would be obviously public interest.
Actually, can I just...
I want to go back to strip searching, just for a minute, and raise a psychological issue that I think is very important and takes off from what Bill was just saying. I mean, we live with a new kind of fear after 9/11, and it is an altogether different phenomenon. And the dilemma, I think the psychological dilemma in counterterrorism that cuts across all of these examples is the more visible the measures are, the more people are going to have heightened fear, which is not productive in enhancing the measures taken in counterterrorism. So, police cars on the bridges with lights going, strips, whether it's in hotels or in searching your bags in subways, reminds people of the danger that in fact is always there, and it's particularly acute for all of us who live in New York. And so you have to try to find a balance, but I think it's very important that it's not just that people will not come and pay $1,000 a day to stay in a fancy hotel if they're going to be strip searched. It's that strip searching is going to remind them how great the danger is, and that's what I think where it directly affects business. And
But that's not a kind of cultural universal, though. I mean, okay, speaking as the sort of the Brit on the panel, and indeed someone who, when the IRA bombed the City of London back in the 90s, the first of the Bishopsgate bomb, I was actually walking towards it when it went off. And there's something about knowing that if you'd been 10 seconds later, you'd have been round a corner and been in a storm of glass shrapnel, to slightly shift your sense of priorities. And I think this is the point. If you look at somewhere like the UK, which, let's face it, is a security state, there's scarcely any place in the main cities where you are not being surveilled by closed-circuit television cameras. The security forces have phenomenally broad powers, which would I'm sure, make the ACLU's hair stand on end without any trouble at all. But nonetheless, the result of decades of terrorist threat, and a very real, very serious, and often, without in any way wanting to praise them, but very professional terrorist threat, is that in fact, I mean, the experience of the UK is the sight of seeing police officers with machine guns at the airport is actually something that is welcomed. It actually makes people feel warm and fuzzy in a way that precisely in New York, it's still at a stage where people think, oh my God, what is the worry? And now, I'm not saying either is better. One could say that, in fact, what has happened is the UK has become desensitized to things they ought not to be desensitized about.
Well, I'm getting a rather sharp split of authority here. You say warm and fuzzy. He says frightened.
Yeah, but I'm a vicious European statist.
No, that's not so totally contradictory. I mean, people are ambivalent. They want the measures of security, understandably want the measures of security, welcome anything that can happen to protect another attack. On the other hand, the visible measures taken to protect us, the visible measures, evoke the continuing fear that is particularly intense in all of us since 9/11. I don't think that's the contradiction you're making it.
I can give a really...
There is a big difference between an airport and an hotel, of course. And it's a cultural, I think it's a cultural aspect of the question, which means you have countries that you have to show the security. It's a need. In India, for instance, okay? In India, if they will not have dozens, sometimes, of people around, it seems strange, okay? In Western countries, it's not necessary. So I think it's a cultural question, and we can understand it. But I can tell you the best efficient security, as far as, of course, we're talking about hotels, okay? Public places, is the undercover security, which means that something that you don't see, so people are not frightened, and they say, what's going on here? On the other side, those people are looking around, they see everything, and they are a part of us, and they can react because they are basically undercover. And this is the best, this is, as far as we are concerned, this is the best security, because then you gain both. There are no panics, but the people are there.
But we're talking now, I think, about the costs of the security consciousness that we rightfully have begun to adopt after 9/11. And it seems to me that what Jacques is talking about, and in general, for example, airport security, that's a minor cost. That's a cost of extreme inconvenience. What Laura talked about earlier, which is the loss of civil liberties, that's obviously a grave cost. In between that, though, I think is what Charles is talking about, which is fear. I mean, I personally don't feel, maybe not as much as Laura does, that we have suffered a grave loss of civil liberties. I much more actually fear the inroads on the liberties of Muslims, of people who are thought in some way to have committed the terrorist act or might intend to or something. But what I think has come to all of our lives is a tremendous sense of fear. And I think one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, how great is the cost, not in inconvenience, but in fearfulness that we're willing to pay for the additional security that we also want, given that fear? I mean, in my case, for example, when I saw the reaction to the idea of having a civilian trial in New York of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and I saw that people just thought this was a terrible idea, even in New York, where I thought kind of people were nonchalant about this, I found that very disturbing, and in a way maybe that's similar to the uproar over the building a mosque downtown. So it does strike me that 9 years after 9/11, even though there has not yet been another attack, the fear level is very great. Think what the fear level would be if there had been another attack. And so, and there will be. And so therefore the fear level will be greater. I find that very troubling.
Well, how do you react to Mark, who says Londoners are happy as clams, that there's a camera staring at them on every street?
That's a very interesting trade-off. I mean, but I think one other point that I imagine Mark might also make is that a country like the UK that has experienced terrorism no longer lives in a world of zero or infinite fear. You live in a world of many different risks and many different fears. Bad things do happen, and you recognize you cannot prevent them from happening. That's different from, I think, this almost apocalyptic fear that we have, because the one event that has happened to us was the one apocalyptic event.
Can I say something about apocalyptic fear? I completely agree. I mean, in my interviewing with survivors and witnesses, I was very struck with the way people experienced 9/11 as an apocalyptic event. It was not. It was tragic. It was huge. The effects are enormous, but it was a large terrorist attack. But it evoked feelings. People experienced it as apocalyptic, and I think that's the deepest level of dread that has remained since 9/11 and poses the greatest problems for counterterrorism, because the fear that lurks just below the surface is the idea, not really of a nuclear bomb, but some kind of dirty bomb, some sort of nuclear event, some sort of radiological event, which is so terrifying that it would not even have to involve a lot of deaths to escalate the fear to huge levels. And I think it poses such problems, but it's so vital for anyone in counterterrorism, and particularly police, to have that to be centrally aware of that level of fear that everybody knows but can't always even give voice to.
I just want to make the point that what I think is really important, certainly to folks in security, law enforcement across the board, is complacency. Is this concern that, well, it's over. It happened one time and we're beyond that. So everybody starts to lower their guard. Now, that is not to say that everybody should have this paranoia, be almost screwed into the ceiling. You know, what's going to happen next? There's got to be, and I think several panelists have said it, there's got to be a balance. Clearly, it's something that we have to address. It's a reality. But we don't, again, have to raise this to the level, unfortunately, as to what they have to do in Israel. When I was over there and trained at their schools, I saw what the people live with every day, where you put a briefcase in a hotel by the desk and you walk 10 feet away and Next thing, 10 people are on you. You know, what's in that briefcase? I think there's a balance, and I think clearly that the United States has done a pretty good job across the board with this balance. And just one last thing, the stadium operations people, the safety and security people have become better at their jobs because of what happened with the tragedy of 9/11. They are much better at what they do and how they do it. There's a higher level of competence because of what they're facing, not only with terrorism, but with crowd management, all the other issues that you face in a facility.
Let me just, if I can, Arthur, add on to a different point. We've spent a lot of time focusing on individual fears and civil liberties, but there is a greater problem. There's a sociological impact to all of this. And one of the things that I recollect after building the first office buildings in the country after 9/11 was the federal government trying to cause most of the financial services industry of New York to basically diversify and become redundant in other areas of the country so that if there were another terrorist attack, the entire financial services industry wouldn't go down. Now, there were great reasons to do that, and I understood the redundancy issues, but had that have happened, New York City could have lost 500,000 jobs. And so I say that because I think that we're having a lot of discussions about what the personal impact or the security impacts could be, but I think we haven't really ventured into what some of the sociological and industrial impacts could be.
Well, Ray started us in that direction by saying people weren't going to pay $800 to $1,000 an evening to be strip searched as they checked in.
Well, no, but what I said
Londoners
is that,
apparently would be happy to have that happen.
They've gone to Canary Wharf as well.
Why don't you photograph people when they check in? Do you photograph people when they check in?
Well, I mean,
I get photographed anytime I walk into an office building.
well, I mean, as we all know, I mean, in the States today, I don't think there is a building, in a public building or a private building, as in a hospitality site today, that does not have its surveillance of everyone in different areas of. In a hotel, we'll have 400 cameras in a hotel. In a hotel.
Your guests know that?
Well, just the next time you're in an elevator, I think when you're fixing your
I'm not asking about the damn elevator, Ray. I want to know if there's a camera in my room.
No.
There is not.
There is not.
There is not?
He didn't answer yet. I want to know this also.
And Keith, why don't you photograph
Well, again,
everyone who comes into BAM?
That's not practical. I mean, we're unlike a sporting event where people kind of tend to come in throughout maybe an hour or an hour and a half before an event starts, and throughout the beginning of it, actually through the first 3 or 4 innings, perhaps. Everybody for performing art is coming in about 10 minutes. So you have to get 2,500 people in the door in a very short period of time. You're not going to photograph them. We have security cameras just like Ray.
You know what's really interesting is that when you put the business factor into the liberty versus security paradigm, and I hadn't really realized this before, but maybe I wasn't listening before tonight, but it's almost like private business has taken it on to make a risk calculation that the government has not taken on. And they say, basically, we don't live in a 100% risk-free society. It's not a no-risk society, and somehow you think you have the forces to make the judgments. And I find this interesting in light of the 9/11 trial that was going to come here, because you referred to it, or whoever referred to it, as the reason it's not here because of fear. But that is not the reason it's not here. As I understand it, the reason it's not here is because when the security plan was laid out by Ray Kelly and others, it would cost businesses in the area too much. And that was a convincing argument. And that's a very different thing than saying it was fear. Now, how the rest of the nation or the media played it out, and the same thing with the mosque downtown. I really wonder if New Yorkers had had a referendum on that, the mosque, if it really would have come down to fear. It was the country coming into a New York conversation in a way that played the fear factor. So I just want to mention that about business. It's a real piece here that's separate than, I think, either the government discourse or the civil liberties discourse, the way we've gotten to know.
why is it that there are 3 major anti-terrorism trials going on right now in Foley Square in the Southern District Court of New York? Faisal Shahzad, the alleged Times Square bomber. Life is going on beautifully in New York. People are not staying away from the courthouse. They're having lunch. They're walking their dogs. They're taking their kids to school. The capacity for Americans to be resilient is also very great. And I think we talk a lot about fear, but our criminal justice system, our anti-terrorism policies, while I think that they are overbroad, they can go on at the same time as normal life. And we're the better for it, because those people are being prosecuted not in military commissions in Guantanamo, but right here in New York, where you can get a great jury pool, where you can have great judges. And so I hear you about the pizza box, but I also think we are living amidst very, very healthy prosecutions of terrorists, and we are going on with our daily lives.
But listen, one of the reasons for that you pointed out, but it's not just these 3 cases. We've done in federal courts here a lot of terrorist cases, and with great success.
Absolutely.
So there's a credibility there. And the argument that's made against it, that it should be in military courts and so on, is primarily a political argument made by political figures that get a gain from it. Because there's no evidence that that is a better route to go, as far as I know, than the federal courts, which not only in this city but elsewhere have had a damn good record.
But what about the Ray Kelly point? I mean, Karen, I think, corrected me quite rightly that the issue is that Commissioner Kelly said that the costs would be so exorbitant in order to have security for this trial that we can't afford to have it and became a business decision. Laura has rightly pointed out that we have all these trials going on of lesser figures, but it hasn't caused a ripple. So I'd love to know, actually, from Bill or others of you who are in the security field, is there a danger, and is this maybe an example of that danger, where we become so worried about security that we say something is not possible, so we can't have it, we have to change a policy because we need to maximize security? Was Ray Kelly maybe wrong in saying it has to be at this level, therefore we can't have it?
Karen's nodding her head.
No, I'm attending those trials. And one trial that I'm attending right now is the Guantanamo trial, and there are a couple of people in the audience that have been there as well. And we go through, everybody who goes into that courtroom, of which there are none of us, I would say there are 6 non-victims or victims' family in the courtroom each day. That's it. That's it, 6 people. This is the only Guantanamo case we have ever seen. This person is actually accused of the embassy bombings, which killed 224 people. So there's a lot of security. I mean, 2 separate security venues that we have to go through. And nobody's there and nobody cares. However, I would distinguish KSM. KSM is, listen, I want the trial here, but KSM may have a different level of it. What I would say is that New York City has really done a good job for 9 years in protecting us, and I personally do not understand why they wouldn't say, we can do this, and we can do this without shutting down business. And I think if they had taken that stand to begin with, we'd be in a much different, we would still be having the trial, and we'd go about our business.
I think the shutting down business, though, is a Chinatown business, which has been grossly affected ever since 9/11. Many of the ways of getting into Chinatown from Lower Manhattan have been sealed off by the barricades around police
Yeah, but that's
that.
different than the Ray Kelly point. The Ray Kelly point, I think, was a case of political hijacking. Yes. Immediately, Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Gillibrand got on that and said, it's going to cost $200 million. It's going to cost $200 million. They saw an opportunity for the city to make money to cover its costs. Now, I think there were some legitimate concerns about trying KSM, but I think that situation got hyped and politically hijacked and taken out of hand, and that New York could safely prosecute KSM in federal district court.
And let me say about the businesses, the Chinatown businesses, it may be that they would suffer. But you know what? This is the balance issue. This is the judgment issue. In my opinion, showing New Yorkers that KSM can be tried here and that we could be safe is the whole ballpark. It's everything, and it would be fine.
I don't disagree with you.
And
I'm
so-
talking
and I've-
about the political issue.
But I'm just saying, I understand that as a political issue, but sometimes you can't do like some people try to do and satisfy everybody, and this is a call.
After all, we continue to build the Second Avenue subway, even though business is dying up there.
There was also an argument, a sort of a spiritual argument made by families, 9/11 families, that it would allow the person who dreamed up the Plains Project to have his day in court a few blocks from Ground Zero. I mean, and I think that issue got used for political purposes, but it was a very real concern of families.
Let's for a moment on that point a finger at Mr. Ritter here, my pal.
Yeah. The mayor, at first, thought it was just, the ultimate injustice to have these down there. I think, and I don't want to take away all the political ramifications because I think they're valid, but there's a simple dollars and cents equation here too. At the time, the commissioner, Kelly, was faced with huge budget cuts. We were at the height of the recession, and he was being told to cut your police department. So all of a sudden, he's now faced with all this money. He wanted federal money. That's pure and simple what he wanted. But, the mayor at first said, this is justice to have this here. We want justice here. And then people started, the political aspects started coming out, and everyone sort of backtracked.
Let me ask you a blunt question. Are you happy with the way the media covers aspects of terrorism?
The media.
Yeah, the media.
Us?
You. Yeah.
Us particularly?
Yeah. ABC.
I think that we do a pretty good job. I think that, we...
Why am I not surprised?
But I think that we have this discussion all the time.
How many days did you cover that clown from Florida threatening to burn the Koran?
Too many.
Mea culpa. Mea culpa. Right there.
But, it was a legitimate story as well.
Was it?
Well,
Yes.
yes, I think it was a legitimate story.
For how many days, Laura?
Well, it probably spanned over 2 weeks, but it engaged the president, Secretary Gates. It threatened the safety and security of our troops. They were concerned about repercussions on the battlefield. And so I think that there was a legitimate coverage of the story. And I was very happy that the Koran burning episode did not happen, and it was resolved through speech. No one was arrested for threatening to burn the Koran. They were not incarcerated. They were not prosecuted. What happened was leaders played a leadership role and talked this minister down from doing something that would jeopardize the nation. And I thought it was a great resolution.
Even the ones who helped foster that mentality and helped whip up some of the frenzy came out and said, don't do this, whatever you do. And the guy got a car out of it from a dealer in New Jersey. Right?
And the guy who did burn, he got fired.
And he got fired.
He got fired. But they say, and you know who they are, and Laura said this earlier in the discussion, that in a curious way, the terrorists have won because they have had such a substantial impact on our lives, whether it be this silly business at the airport or at the stadium, or it's Charles had to leave, so he wasn't protesting, he had to leave. Or Charles's point, the creation of fear. And some people say it is the media and the media coverage of terrorist conduct or terrorist threats that really amplifies the impact of the would-be terrorists, that you're unindicted co-conspirators.
And so when we cover, I can think of half a dozen instances where we cover situations where it shuts down the Triborough Bridge. A car that was abandoned became a suspicious vehicle, and the Triborough was shut for most of the night one night. Well, we covered it, and we stayed late, hot, on the not on the air, but on standby, until it was resolved. But that's a major public service issue. So, where do you draw the line? We didn't cover the pizza that was shut down Times Square. We didn't do it. We did cover the gardener's gasoline can in the back of his seat that shut down a whole area in front of Con Ed because it was right after Faisal Shahzad and Times Square, and it became a newsworthy event. But we think about this all the time. We do not want to scare people. Even we think about it when we break in with breaking news in the middle of a program. Before 9/11, we didn't think about the impact so much about what it would sound like. Now we think about it all the time, and we try to be calm. We do not want to rile anybody unnecessarily.
Ray, I know you're a nice guy, and you don't think ill of anyone. But do you have any sense of whether media coverage and the constant reminder of what might happen impacts the number of people who check into the Pierre?
It is a reality today. We have to deal with it. And it's like anything else. I think the media has to balance their fair reporting and what is essentially their responsibility to the public safety. So it's a balance just as well for the media as it is for a business decision. And I mean, from a personal perspective, had the press not covered the Mumbai attacks the way it had, we would. They were essentially broadcasting in advance where everyone was, and the handlers were sending them to those areas. And I know I was sitting in my office at 11 p.m. and Peter Greenberg called me. He's going to be on air on CBS to speak to me in my office, while at the same time, and it just my PR agents, my PR guys from New York said no way, and it just cut it. It didn't happen. So there's a balance, and when that's happening, it's really hard to make that call of what's going to be. Someone's making that call, and the media is responsible, just as business is, for the lives that are at stake.
But if we're talking about balance, I mean, but Swift, I mean, you're absolutely right that sometimes there is a tactical reason why you do not want particular specific information out there on the air. But more broadly, certainly I confess that I would be a lot more worried about a policy of deliberate manipulation of terrorist-related media stories. I would rather that the media sometimes be perhaps irresponsible about breaking something that isn't really a big deal, creating a sense of public disquiet that maybe didn't need to be there, than the sense that there was actually a much more strategic thing of saying, well, we think there's a story here, but for political reasons, we would rather the public not know. Firstly, because it doesn't work. I mean, we have societies which have massive levels of information control that still have terrorism. It's not as though, the Chechens decided, oh, well, because the Russian state controls the media, we won't bother trying to do anything. But secondly, if we're talking about how terrorists can make us change, I think that would be a very, very dramatic way in which they would have won in terms of changing our balance between media, state, and society.
Well, I don't hear from Bill that First Amendment values or the public's right to know trumps everything. Have you taken a little off your fastball on that score?
No,
that's what I used to hear in the 80s and 90s from your cohorts.
And it's still obviously an incredibly important part of what we do. The WikiLeaks last weekend, on Friday, where you had, obvious cover-up by government about what happened in Iraq, proves the point. But we do not raise the First Amendment banner at the jeopardy of lives. I mean, we wouldn't do that. When there's a hostage situation and we're on the air with it live, we're not telling the viewer and therefore maybe the hostage taker who might be watching television, where the police are. We're extremely conscious of that. So there's a responsibility. Jim knows this.
But I mean, leaving aside the question of media, I think we're kind of excusing by not mentioning political policymakers. When we ask, where does all this fearfulness come from? Is the media responsible? Well, you'll remember that when Obama campaigned for president, he campaigned against what he called the color-coded politics of fear. So we've said nothing so far about how it is that 9/11 was, how it fit into our political discourse and how the Bush administration chose to deal with these issues. And it does seem to me that part of the reason we live in this republic of fear is that it's in part a consequence of decisions that the Bush administration made and that turned out to be very, very difficult to unmake. And so I think that especially Dick Cheney's, this famous 1% calculus that he had. If there's a 1% chance of a bad thing happening, we have to devote our huge resources to doing something about it. I think that a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the actions of the years immediately after 9/11 helped instill this kind of permanent foundation of fear. And it's not as if some new president, Obama or someone else, can just say, will now use a new language. He wants to, but it's a very long-term thing. And I think we live with the consequences of the fact that the person who happened to be president when 9/11 happened was George Bush and not somebody else.
But let's give George Bush a little bit of credit here, which he also, right after 9/11, tried to calm what might have grown much larger, the sense that Islam as a religion was responsible for this rather than individual people.
Yeah, yes, and I give him credit for that.
I think there's no way to have a society in which you have a reasonable flow, free flow of information without having distortions built in from time to time. If you have a society, however, which in its civil society, in its judiciary, and in its political offices has enough residual strength, you can begin to offset the things that are done in haste and in fear. And that is part of living, I'm afraid. We already have seen a number of the things that were passed in the Bush administration now rejected. And that, it would have been nice if it hadn't happened in the first place. I suppose it would have been nice if Abraham Lincoln had not done away with habeas corpus. But these things happen. The thing that I think we've got to keep an eye on is that in a society like this one, you want to make sure that you have not torn down all the skeptics, and I don't mean just individuals, I mean whole organizations who are here to raise questions, to say, prove it to me that you have to do that to make us safe. Prove it to me that what you're doing really does fit within the letter of the law. And that's where we come up with groups like yours and mine that play such an invaluable role, not only when something is occurring, but after it has occurred, when maybe there's some cleanup that has to be done.
Yeah, and I would actually make a distinction between fear and risk management, and I think they're two very different things. I don't feel currently like I live in a culture of fear, but I do feel like I take precautions, and I think that most businesses and government officials take precautions. I also think that there's a distinction between mainstream media, which I do think functions at a level of journalistic integrity, versus the blogs. And just an example on the blogs, the new arena which is being built in Brooklyn, which I had a little to do with, which has not been mentioned much, has gone to incredible precautions in terms of security, but yet the blogs during the public approval process tried to use the environmental studies and the public hearings for them as a way of getting the public officials and businesses to talk about the security for that arena, knowing full well that we never could, because the moment we talked about it, we made it vulnerable. So this is the sort of juxtaposition that on the other side, both as a government and official and a business person, you have to play in terms of how the media could be used.
Well, there's no doubt there's a catch-22 here, because it's perfectly clear my old friend Bill Bratton has gone to ground. He won't talk very much tonight. Kevin won't talk. You won't talk. Because as you say, the minute you talk, you let the cat out of the bag in a way.
To that point, the night before the first World Series game at Yankee Stadium, where the president was coming to throw out the first ball, and obviously there was a lot of tension throughout the city, Major League Baseball put me up to talk with a network reporter about what was going on, what the preparation was, what was my confidence or lack thereof of what was going to happen. And I tell you what, I think the media served a very useful purpose that afternoon, because it allowed me to kind of, without going into specifics as to the technology and resources that we were using that particular night. I mean, I was able to make a pretty good case about Secret Service and the FBI and NYPD and all the different agencies that were involved at Yankee Stadium that night, and the fact that it wasn't just that night. While they were playing in Arizona, we had groups working at Yankee Stadium, working on game plans, working on, drills, tabletop exercises, evacuation, all sorts of things that we had in place. And I think to some degree it was a commercial, because at the end of the interview I just said, it's going to be a great game and security is not going to be an issue, nor was it. So I think the media really served the purpose.
I don't think New Yorkers are going to, and Americans, I would hope they wouldn't, buy into this without questioning it. And I think that, that wasn't an accident. I think that, there was a sales pitch to say, here's what the security we're taking, and, we hope it's not going to be too much of an inconvenience. But if you just did this without talking about it, I think people would be really ticked off. And I wouldn't blame them. We want our freedoms, and unless we can be convinced that, all right, we're going to have our bags searched when we go to the subways or whatever it is, whatever possible impingement on our civil rights is, we better damn well be explained what's happening. Otherwise, I would hope that New Yorkers and Americans wouldn't put up with that.
Well, listen to all this stuff, Laura. You've got to your right somebody who comes from London and says everything's okay. To his right is someone from Israel who says everything's okay. Now you have Bill sort of saying that. You've got Stuckey over here saying River City's in great shape. Just a little inconvenience. What are you beefing about?
Well, for example, all of our communications abroad, whether they're telephone or internet, are routinely intercepted by the government without warrant. If you end up having the wrong name and you end up on a no-fly list, you're in a nightmarish zone. The government has made the no-fly list so much larger under the Obama administration that people are stranded abroad and can't get back into the country. Your laptop and all the contents of your laptop or BlackBerry can be seized at the border now without a warrant, and all the contents downloaded by a border agent and you don't have to be given an explanation.
Now, are you putting this on the basis of individual inconvenience, or are you putting this on some grand philosophical plane?
Both. I think we have absorbed significant erosions of our rights without the necessary requirement of proof that shows that we are being made more secure. I think some of this is legitimate security. I don't disparage at all what all of these gentlemen do for a living. I think it's very important. But I also think some of it is faux security. I think these all-body scanners, for example, would not have identified the man who was the underwear bomber on the airplane, because they do not identify, thick diapers. But nevertheless, we're spending millions of dollars on these all-body scanners. And so I think we've made some very significant trade-offs, and certainly in how we prosecute people, the presumption of innocence, things like the material support statute, where you can give someone legal pleadings and be prosecuted under federal material support statutes because you are assisting a terrorist even when you're doing your job as a lawyer. So I think we're not really aware of the liberties that we've lost, but I think when they come for a friend of ours, when the government comes after a friend of ours, we will be astounded and surprised how little recourse we have against some of these entrenched anti-terrorism policies.
Now, Jacques, anybody beef at El Al?
Before El Al, it is, I accept, which mean I understand the arguments, which mean it is true that there is a problem if you want maximum security, so you have to pay the price, and the price is liberties, etc., etc. But first of all, there is not maximum 100% security. It just doesn't exist. Okay, it cannot be, particularly with the phase of terror that we are now, which is very, very particular. The terror that exists today is not the terror that we had in 9/11. It's completely different. It's a different type of terror. Never mind, we can analyze it. Anyway, so it is clear that we have to pay the price. But on the other hand, if the level of terror today is what it is, okay, it's probably because or in favor of all the measures that has been taken, which means this is clear that if not, it is absolutely 100% sure that if not, the level of terror was increasingly higher.
I just want to say one quick thing. I'm want to accept that, but it's also true that if I say that I have an elephant gun, and in my whole lifetime I've never been attacked by an elephant because I now have an elephant gun, you know, the logic doesn't always flow that these policies are making us safer. It could be that we have reduced forces in Iraq, and that's what's made us safer. We have perhaps elected a president who refuses and repudiates torture, and that's made us safer. I'm not sure that these so-called security measures are the things that we can point to that really cause us to be less prone to a terrorist attack.
I want to know, I think, Jim, you react to this. New York has shown resiliency since 9/11. How do you account for that?
I think that New York is a strong city economically, and I think it's diverse. On the other hand, I think if there would be another serious attack, it wouldn't be so resilient a second time. And I worry deeply about that because, as I said before, many companies have in fact diversified. Many companies have taken critical facilities out of New York to other places. The cost of building many buildings has gone up exponentially in order to make it secure, which ultimately has an effect on the bottom line, which ultimately gets passed on to the consumer and contributes to job loss. So it has been resilient in some respects because of its economic and ethnic diversity, but I wouldn't ride that too long. I mean, I think that another serious issue is one that could have a very damaging effect to New York City and other cities as well.
How many of you have go bags? Come on, fess up.
You mean in case there's a sudden...
Yeah, come on, fess up.
I sure don't.
You sure don't. None of you have go bags?
Do you have one?
I don't have one. I can barely spell go. I wouldn't know where to go. In the audience, how many of you have go bags? Come on, you're anonymous out there. Fess up. A few hands, a few hands.
I have one.
You have one.
I have two in my office with 2 gas masks, and but the filters are outdated. I'm sure. There's a life to those things, right? Yeah, so they're outdated.
Karen, you no go bag?
No.
But you left New York after 9/11.
Yeah.
If I invade your privacy.
I did not exactly leave New York after 9/11. I still lived here. But I partially left New York after 9/11. And I don't have a go bag. And my children have, when we had the power outage that next summer, I can remember my daughter saying to me, "Mommy, you don't have a go bag?" And I was like, "Honey, no, I don't." And a lot of this, I mean, we haven't talked about this tonight, but a lot of this is the perception of what you convey in terms of fear to the people around you. And I don't think a go bag would help if you want to know the truth. And I think it's important. Yes, you could say, yes, we're going to make up for every possibility. We'll have a flashlight, we'll have this, we'll have that, we'll have money. But I think basically what we should say is, we live here and we live with the risk. And I think that will ultimately make my children feel safer.
Jim, I always have viewed you as sort of a senior philosopher. You know, as you sit up there on Mount Olympus.
Which Jim are we
Which
talking
Jim
about?
That's right.
Not old enough to be a senior philosopher.
We actually have 4 Jims up there. I'm talking about Jim Hoge. The civil liberties security dynamic. What do you make of this discussion?
I think Laura at one point got it a way that I like it, which is we do not object to society taking measures to protect itself, particularly when there are threats the like of which we have had. But if that's going to happen, it's in human nature that some people are going to overstep. They're going to take too much liberty in the name of order. And that's why you need organizations that are skeptical in nature and are trained to ask questions and, if necessary, to roll things back. As I said, it's not just a question of stopping a deterioration of rights before something happens, although that's very important, but it is looking after the situation has calmed down again to see where there has been undue, unnecessary overarming, if you will, and to seek a rollback. Without that, I think you're going to get a society in which no comment, and there are times when that's a very responsible, becomes so prevalent, and that no one in the general public has a reasonably accurate picture of what is going on. We know what happens when that is the case. Go to Iran, which I have done. You will hear every block, you will hear about 6 different conspiracies, all of them more wacky than the last, and all of them based on the only information they can get, rather than some that may not be totally accurate or totally full, but at least has made the effort. So I think you've got to be very careful that, and you have to have organizations that are willing to be skeptical even when it's not popular. Without that, I think you're all going to wish for the day in which somebody took a look at the emperor and said, he's got too many clothes on.
All right, we have a microphone in the center aisle. We'd love to have some Q&A with folks in the audience. Go ahead.
I'd be interested in some predictions for the future.
Oh, gosh.
All right, predictions for the future. Let's speculate.
Yankees won't win the World Series. I'm safe with
You've
that.
broken John and my heart. Predictions for the future. Jim, you're this Jim Stuckey. You're the personification of New York in a sense.
Thank you.
Predict New York.
Well, I do see New York as a city that will continue to thrive, because I do think that the World Trade Center event was essentially a black swan event. And I think that most of the types of activities that we have to worry about now are more of what someone referred to that I remember of the FALM and the Black Liberation Army types of threats, where you can have smaller types of terrorist acts akin to what we've seen in other countries internationally, which are incredibly disruptive, but not necessarily of the type that could cause the kind of devastation we saw in the World Trade Center.
Now, Bill Bratton, you've recently been appointed to this big Homeland Security post. As you view what we've been talking about from that perch, tell us what you predict for New York.
There will be incidents. That's the reality. The good news, if you will, is that, as he's just stated, the likelihood is that there'll be the lone wolf type incident, or the more traditional event, rather than the catastrophic repeat of the World Trade Center event, or the nuclear, the radiological, or the biological. Those are threats farther out. We're getting better at the ability to detect those through intelligence as well as equipment, so that the fact that they're having such a hard time, they meaning the terrorists, those, the Al-Qaeda type terrorists, they would be most prone to use those types of devices. They're having a hard time getting the materials, putting it together, which is good news for us because it gives us more time to improve our intelligence gathering, to improve our detection capabilities. We are a work in progress. Democracy is a work in progress. The whole tension between civil liberties and the need to have detection capabilities. Homeland Security is a work in progress. We're getting better at it all the time. Where we were in 1994, when I was police commissioner in New York, within a year of the first World Trade Center bombing, I did not spend 1% of my time on terrorist-related activities. We thought it was all over, and the federal government was going to take care of it going forward. As police chief in Los Angeles, after 9/11, I spent 40 to 50% of my time as a major city chief on terrorism-related activities, issues, seminars, programs, and retraining my department. After Mumbai, we totally retrained the whole Los Angeles Police Department to be prepared to deal with the Mumbai incident, because that is the more likely incident we're going to deal with, rather than, fortunately, the nuclear catastrophe or the biological. There will be incidents. That's the reality. But there was a report out last week, just to put things in perspective, that an American is much more likely to be killed in a traffic accident overseas than they are to be killed in a terrorist incident. So all this hoopla over the reports in London a couple of weeks ago, the idea was that it was still going to be more likely that you're going to be killed in a traffic accident than you'd be the victim of a terrorist incident anywhere in Britain during the midst of that.
Yeah, I just want to come back to where you started this whole thing, which was the definition of terrorism. And it sounded like what it had to do with...
You have to get close.
It sounded like what it had to do with was creating uncertainty and the fact that one was not an established type of organization. So I was just wondering, since it's not being the established type of organization, because it seems the military certainly creates uncertainty wherever they go. So if you wish to do away with terrorism, maybe we should just encourage all terrorists to become military? Would they no longer be terrorists at that point? And would that be the end of terrorism if we just insisted they had to be military?
Karen, you're the deep intellectual academic on this.
Yeah. Well, the thing about terrorists, as we define them, is that they are non-state actors and that they are not organized under any banner. We now call them enemy belligerent, either lawful or unlawful, is what the distinction we make now. And so it's sort of a contradiction in terms of the way you pose the question. They're not part of an army, as we define an army, and international law defines an army, and therefore we wouldn't see them in that context, I guess.
I guess I'm asking, if bin Laden gives them a banner, does that make them an army, and then are they...
Well, I still think they'd have to have a state. I mean, in our understanding, they'd have to have a state, and they'd have to probably have a government behind them, and that our government is going to stick to that definition for quite a while. So, no. At this point, no.
Next.
Albert Golson, U.S. Homeland Security. Amongst the panelists, who is for and who is against the issuance of a national ID card? And if you can give a quick comment why you would be for or against the issuance of one.
Because Americans have a national ID card. It's called a driving license. I mean,
well, not everybody has a driver's license.
No, we don't have a national ID card because the driver's license database is not connected nationally. And the government tried to compel states to create a national ID card, but it wasn't successful because it cost the states too much money to come up with federal compliance. So I'm opposed to a national ID card, surprise.
Anyone at the table for a national ID card? Leave cost to one side.
I'm very much in favor of it.
Say again, Bill.
I'm very much in favor of it.
Speak.
National ID card, have your blood type on there, have a lot of information on there that I just don't see what the big issue is about a national ID card. You have to produce, to check into a hotel now, they want a driver's license with a photo on it. You know, I think this is one of those issues that's totally overblown. It's the concern, I think, from the Civil Liberties Union and others would be the idea that's a further erosion, if you will, of the privacy rights, et cetera. But I just don't have a problem with it. I supported, when I was chief of police in Los Angeles, took a lot of heat from the anti-immigration folks because I was in favor of giving illegal immigrants driver's licenses. If they want to give me 10 fingerprints and a photograph, I'm more than happy to give them a driver's license because then maybe they'll get insurance and then maybe they'll take driver's exams.
How about at birth issuing the ID card with the fingerprint and a little
at
DNA?
Birth, I'd take the fingerprints, the footprints.
A little DNA?
And the DNA. Once again,
Firstborn,
safeguards
how much
the
do you
idea.
want on the card?
No, in terms of it's my perspective on it may be at odds with most, but I just don't have a
Bill, how much does this really improve security from your point of view if we don't also make it much more likely that you can stop anybody anytime and ask them for their ID?
Well, the idea would be, in fact, that you'd have to have a reason for asking for the identification, but the facilitation of it in terms of the investigation, if you will, or the interview. Again, it's, I think of myself as pretty much of a progressive on law enforcement issues. I don't think of myself as a hardliner. I basically, in California, like I say, I hear when I was in New York, very much supportive of a lot of the issues around immigration and dealing with illegal immigrants in a fair and decent way. But no, I just think that there is room for something along the line of a national ID card that could facilitate so many things in terms of in our society and our lives in a good way, and not in if you controlled it and dealt with it. And that's part of what the whole democracy issue is about, that we have that ability. I thought your point about that nut job that wanted to burn the Koran was right. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but we resolved that issue without basically resorting to violence, that the president on down, everybody got into it, everybody had their say, and we got through it. And that's what we do in America. We talk our way through. I think we can talk our way through, should have the debate about the driver's license, about the national ID card, and let everybody get into the mix and then make a decision about it.
I was interested by the fact that as you were talking, our business panelists were all nodding in approval.
Well, I'll just say, again, I look at the issue as being able to be spun one way or another, but, you know, should we shut down the internet because some people will use it for inappropriate purposes? And I would argue no, and I agree with Bill that having an ID card has many, many benefits that go well beyond how some might use it inappropriately, and I would argue that if they were going to use it inappropriately. You know, when Ed Koch once talked about corruption in government, and he got to the point where he said that if he passed a law, the people who were going to break it would break it anyhow. And if he didn't have a law, the honest people probably would follow the law anyhow. And so the point is, do you not take precautions because of a few people who may do inappropriate things? And I just can't argue on the side of that. I think you have to take the precautions.
As a youth, when I went to Europe for my first and second time and checked into hotels and gave them my passport, stupid me, I said that could never happen in the United States. And here we are. Yes?
I come from more of a visual rhetoric background, so excuse me if it's a little off-kilter, but we haven't really spoken about the memorialization of 9/11 in New York, as it's particular to New York, and the constructions that we've made, and the rituals that we formed, even from a news perspective of reading the names. It's broadcast locally all over New York every morning on September 11th. If anyone could speak to, from either a logistical and business standpoint, or what the memorialization of 9/11 has done in terms of security. There's been a lot of talk about what we build there, what it says, does it make us more prone to attack? But also as recent as using the kind of fetishization of memorializing victims to use it as an excuse to maybe people protesting that you can not have a center, a Muslim center or a mosque, because it denigrates victims. So I wanted to know what some of you may have thought about what we've done so far in terms of memorializing 9/11, and then what it might mean for our security.
Yeah, I think that this one specific part of this, which is this question of how you deal with the deep feelings of victims. This came up, for example, in the question of the building of the mosque. And some of the people who argued against the building of the mosque said, it's very upsetting to the victims, understandably, and we have to give extra credence to that. Well, I think we have to listen clearly to the victims, but I worry that there is too great a willingness to, I mean, I'm not sure I'd say fetishize, but maybe it can arrive at that. It's sort of like saying that you should decide on a severe punishment for a crime because that's what the survivor would like to see. So I don't think we should stop reading the names of victims, God knows, on 9/11, but I do think that it would not be a bad thing if this could sort of just diminish over time, and we would think of ourselves less in this victim sense and sort of more face towards the future.
Okay, we're well past our close time, so I want to give these people short, quick questions or what have you.
All right, what about infrastructure or financial terrorism?
Financial terrorism. Anybody for it?
What I mean by infrastructure, I'm talking about sewers or reservoirs or
Jim, you're leaning
electric grid.
forward.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think they're two very distinct things. I worry much more about the financial terrorism than I do the physical infrastructure, because sitting on a design commission, I have a fairly good sense of what New York City does for its physical infrastructure related to water supply and other parts of critical infrastructure. I do worry substantially more about business infrastructure when I see viruses that could penetrate government agencies and businesses. That troubles me deeply.
Okay, Bill, you have to leave.
I do, but it's been
He
a
has
pleasure.
to be on air at 11 o'clock.
Channel 7, Eyewitness News, 11 o'clock. Thank you all very much.
I had a question for Mr. Ritter. NPR's firing of Juan Williams. What are your take on that?
NPR's firing Ron Williams. She put out, the president today, or yesterday, I guess, put out an apology to all of their employees, saying that she handled it really poorly. She didn't prepare them for it. She was wrong to say. She's apologized on the weekend.
Your views, sir.
My views. Yeah. I think that they gave Fox News an enormous amount of free publicity. They took swift and shrewd advantage of it. I think it was probably a short-sighted move, but I also suspect, and I don't have any inside information, that he had some long-standing, simmering disagreements with his employer, because I'm not sure that what he said was, if you just prima facie what he said, I don't think they should have fired him for that. It seems to me that there was some long-standing feud between the two. But certainly, you got to hand it to Fox News. They know how to take advantage of situations, and he got a $2 million contract for appearing twice a week for 3 years.
Jealousy.
No. I'm just, yes, of course. but I think that it's a very shrewd move. So
good to see you.
But thank you. And I do think one thing. I think that the media. I worry about what's ahead. I worry that the media, are not doing our jobs as well as we used to do in this regard, asking the tough questions. So much of it is business. We have caught James's newspaper. The most important newspaper in this country is, a fraction of what it once was, and I worry that it's not going to be around. And heaven help us if it's not around, because we all depend on the investigative reporting of real newspapers. And I worry that we're not doing our job because of it. We are under cost-cutting thresholds that are enormous, and it's hurting our ability to do what Jim was talking about and what you were talking about. It's really scary. And that's part of the First Amendment function. And the whole, the banner that people are raising, the red flags we're raising about the security industrial complex that's emerging here is big business. No one knows that better than our former mayor. He has made that, he didn't go into the securities business, he went into the security business. And I think that says a lot about where we're headed. But I worry about my own industry and where we're headed.
You're part of Disney, aren't you?
We are owned by the Walt Disney Company, yes. I wouldn't say I'm part of
There's a truthful journalist.
Well, we say that all the time. We are owned by the Walt Disney Company. I'm proud of it, but and who knows? We are the biggest television station in the country, and we have not cut staff. So Walt Disney Company has upheld the First Amendment better than some of our competitors, I would say.
Well, next week your co-anchor will be Mickey Mouse.
Let's hope not.
Over there.
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm from Global Affairs. I just wanted to ask real quickly, though, what would happen to national security architecture if, say, tomorrow, Al-Qaeda sends in a videotape and it surrenders? Just a what-if question.
Where's the party?
If Al-Qaeda surrendered, what would happen? There'll be son of Al-Qaeda the next day?
There'll be someone to take their place, I'm sure.
Those were the days when there was actually an organization. I mean, this is it. Al-Qaeda has become an ideology of jihad rather than actually a sort of an organization where there's someone whom you can deal with or someone who can surrender.
Hi, my name is Ryan Osborne. I'm a police officer, going to a precinct. I want to know how big is Al-Qaeda's footprint in South America in light of MS-13 and the drug cartels. The drug cartels seem to be moving, and we're squeezing them, and that's why the violence seems like Mexico's turned into a failed state. And I know Al-Qaeda's made an alliance with MS-13, basically, to get a nuclear bomb through our country. And I wonder if panel's thoughts about that, basically.
Anyone have intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about this, which is there's thought to be a Hezbollah connection in parts of South America. The question of the drug Al-Qaeda connection is something you hear a great deal about. If you talk to people in the drug enforcement world, there's not yet any evidence that, for example, the fear, which is that Al-Qaeda elements in North Africa are teaming up with drug traffickers who are bringing drugs across from South America. It could happen. It makes sense that it might happen, but I think so far it's a little bit of a kind of a bogey. It's not, there's not yet evidence that that's the case.
I don't think this, which is that I think we got to be careful about that, using that label much too freely. There is something called Al-Qaeda. It's a command center in the Pakistani hills. But an awful lot of the terrorism in the world that predates Al-Qaeda is still with us and will be here after Al-Qaeda is gone. Much of it is local rather than sort of global or utopian, which Al-Qaeda is in its objectives. Most terrorism has regional or specific political objectives that they are after. And I'm afraid terrorism goes in waves historically and peaks at some point. You're never quite sure when or why. It hasn't peaked at this point, this current wave of terrorism, which has been going on and building up for about a quarter of a century. And I think we have to understand that whether Al-Qaeda, if was to give up tomorrow, the 3 or 4 who are the command people, you would still face a world with a considerable amount of differentiated terrorism, some of it very local, some of it not so local.
But I would just simply say, by the way, I don't think that you could sell many drugs to dead Americans. So to the extent that the Mexican drug cartels are attempting to, they're businesses. I mean, they're vicious businesses. Right. So I'm not sure at the end of the day, what the benefit is for them to see America in disarray.
Well, all right, I'm going to exercise my totalitarian power and end this. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the panelists.